Hello and welcome to the PSR's new author interview series, where we take time to talk with researchers, academics, and authors that have published papers with us. My name is Mark Kaye, and I'm the Senior Research Associate at the PSR. Today, I'll be speaking with Dr. William O'Broctor regarding his paper, How Human Coding is Used and Described. Dr. William O'Broctor is an assistant professor of political science at the Texas Lutheran University and director of professional development for the American Political Science Association Civic Engagement Section. Good afternoon, Dr. O'Broctor, and thank you for being here with me.
Thanks so much. It's great to be able to talk to you.
Thanks. Okay, so we'll launch straight in. If you could begin, please, by telling us a little bit about what you're investigating in this paper, and perhaps for some of our non-academic audience, perhaps explain a little bit about what you mean by human coding.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. This paper came about when I was engaging in human coding processes myself as part of my research. And so in doing that, I'm asking either myself or other individuals that are trained in the process of trying to understand different phenomena. And so we're taking data and we're, by going through a systematic process, identifying different characteristics out of those data using humans as part of that approach. And the way that I was doing it initially was for caste coding. And this is a perfect example of human coding situation, because in trying to identify someone's caste, we could, of course, ask them a question, what is your caste? But if we have political elites or elected officials, it's a little bit more difficult to get in and ask them that question. And then similarly, they might respond in a way that's has social bias or political bias when we might want a different form of caste coding. And so humans are perfect for undertaking this activity because they have a lot of contextual knowledge about what this phenomenon might mean. However, the problem is that by having that contextual knowledge, a lot of times it's not written down how the humans arrived at the response. So in this case, what caste they might have categorized someone into. And so as I was going through that process in some of my own research, then I started wondering, well, what are the standards for human coding and describing and using human coders in the discipline? Because I wanted to do a good job in describing my methodology and therefore thought that it was important to include some details about the process, but I didn't really know what details needed to be included. And so that led to this paper. I was motivated to then go and try to do a state of the field paper. Political Studies Review has a state of the field section, which is why I ended up publishing with PSR. And that meant that I did a review of some of the major journals in political science, how different people have approached and used human coders. So the data was from 2010 to 2024. 2010 was right around where major journals started having supplemental appendices or online information where you could actually describe in some detail what some of the processes were. It's when replication data became popular, this type of thing. And I collected these data using human coders in a lot of the major US political science journals, trying to keep things consistent across the different types of journals and looking for variation between different subfields of political science. Someone might use a human coder differently in political theory than they might in international relations, I thought. And through that process, then I tried to look for three different, what I'll call like very minimal characteristics or standards for how human coding is described. The first is reliability. Did the paper author somewhere in the main text of the paper or in the supplemental information talk about intercoder reliability in however the human coding measure was determined? And I find that this is just like not how reliable it is, just did you even bother or use the opportunity to talk about it? And 30% of papers don't mention any form of reliability measure at all. Second, then I looked at how coders were described. So if I just say a human coder did this, I don't really have any information on if that was me as the author, if that was an expert, if that was a graduate student, this type of information. And so I was looking for, was there any description beyond just a human coder? This is kind of a standard in many other social science disciplines to give some description of how is this person qualified to do the human coding. 37% of the articles I found did not include a coder description of any kind. They just said a coder did this, right? Finally, I was looking for replicable coding procedures. This is the hardest to engage in, and by doing this, I actually use some human coding with another coder to look at the different articles and figure out, is there any possibility that you, not knowing what the content of the article was, could go and code the data in a similar way? And this was a very loose interpretation. Was it just a human coder did this and then there's some results presented without any procedures justified? Or was there at least a minimal level of detail provided? And here I find that 41% of those articles lacked replicable procedures by this minimal definition. The other interesting thing was that they're really, most of the articles that used human coders were doing it in a way to provide an application. So they were using the human coders to get their data, in other words. We've talked a lot recently about artificial intelligence, machine learning, how they may replace or supplement or augment human coders. Some other articles were using those techniques, but still the human coders are very important in collecting a lot of types of political science data. So even though we have the rise of machine learning, which I think fundamentally often relies on human coders, we still have a lot of tasks in political science that engage in human coders themselves. And so that's one way that I think, in terms of key findings for the paper, this paper is relevant for a lot of different authors.
Okay, wonderful. I mean, you discussed there in some detail some of your kind of key findings. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about what you see as the implications of these findings on the quality of research and perhaps more broadly on the discipline of political science?
Sure. So I tried in the piece to be very careful to say, basically, these are the findings. And then we need to have some form of disciplinary conversation about what are standards for using human coders. In other ways, the discipline has had conversations about replication data, for example, supplemental information, for example, even the standards for doing statistical research about p-values, Bayesian analysis, etc. I wouldn't take the findings from these three particular items that I looked at and say, well, then every journal should now go and have this standard, and every person should go and fit all of these three criteria. I think what needs to happen is that there should be a conversation in the discipline about what does human coding mean? How is it valuable? And then how can we come up with some alternative ways to approach the human coding process that fit different people's needs? An example I think of that the discipline has been trying to do this is with pre-registration. So some journals have started requiring pre-registration, but then there's been a discussion from other authors about how pre-registration, putting your findings and your methodology in a repository before you've collected the findings, how that might not be appropriate for their type of research. And I think that same kind of conversation needs to happen here with the use of human coders. If we just go and say, you will do these three things, then we're going to get authors who might want to just meet those three minimum criteria, as opposed to then thinking about what does it mean in their circumstance to use human coders. And so then also for policy practitioners or for the wider audience, I think it's important at least to be attentive to the fact that much political science data uses human coding underlying the processes. And if we don't really understand the quality, accuracy, validity, reliability of those data, then we should at least be thinking about that when we look at the results. And perhaps that can help explain why one study might be finding certain types of results in one direction, and another study might be doing it in a different direction. Often, once we see the data, we're like, oh, this data is collected. Then we don't spend a bunch of time thinking about how that collection process occurred. And that's really what I'm trying to start a conversation about in the paper. And then hopefully a number of other people can come together in terms of the implications, both from the policy side and the political science author side and the journal side, and think more about how do we have a bigger conversation about this challenge.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I mean, you do mention at the end of the paper, you discuss your recommendations, and you've discussed here with me about this idea of the discipline starting this conversation. Do you have any other specific recommendations that you should think that should be put in place moving forward?
So one would be from the journal perspective to invite authors to mention or provide authors with space to start describing the human coding process. So before we get to the point where we have set standards for a journal, if that ever occurs, it should just be a reminder to authors that, hey, this is one of the decisions that you made, along with many other methodological decisions. We invite you and we recognize the ability for you to discuss the human coding process in your article and provide some space to do that, right? Either as a supplemental appendix or additional space in the manuscript itself. The second thing that kind of came up through the process is this question of who is doing the coding. So even though that wasn't inherent in the data analysis process, I was just looking at was the coder described. I think that a natural follow-on to this study is to focus on the types of people who are engaged in the research collection and the data analysis process. So in looking at who was doing the coding, about 42% of those individuals are students of some kind, either undergraduate students or graduate students, research assistants, etc. About 12% are crowd workers, so someone working on Amazon Mechanical Turk or another platform being paid for each form of coding that they're doing. And in both of those categories, there are power dynamics at play in who's performing the coding, how the coding is being performed, and how those individuals might interact with the author. This is not a particular thing for the methodology of human coding being wrong or being flawed, but it is a way to reveal in political science as a discipline some of the structural power dynamics that are at play for how we collect and engage with research. And I think that becomes even more important when we look at machine learning and AI algorithms, because then again, instead of the research assistant or student performing the human coding, they're now writing the algorithms. And so that even obscures their relationship and their input to the data, perhaps even more. So I think that type of conversation is also particularly important. For the researcher perspective, like straight up, what should you do? I think just being generous and keeping in mind that you should, if at all possible, describe the bare minimum of what might be required to engage in a robust replication of your data. And that means different things for different people, as it should. But also by doing that and by being willing to engage in that process, then we can collect some more data over time on what do best practices look like. And then journals can help develop those best practices, et cetera. One other thing I would make as a caveat for the findings for the paper is that they're focused on general interest journals, particularly in the United States. And that's a limitation that I will name because different regions and different subfields of political science will engage in this question differently. The reason that I used general interest journals in the US was to see differences between subfields and try to think of some comparability between journals that are publishing similar topics. But I certainly know that there's a lot we can learn from specific subfields of political science that are leading this discussion. In qualitative research, for example, those authors have been long attentive to what human coding looks like, what are the power dynamics in the discipline, how do graduate students contribute, those types of things. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for other authors in the future to more systematically look at the policies and procedures at other journals, including Political Studies Association, et cetera, and then see from there if there's anything we can learn more generally that can be useful for the rest of the discipline. You know, it's really hard to get the American Political Science Association or any other political science association to establish these types of standards But the first step is at least, I think, having a conversation and journals and authors kind of leading the way. And so that's what I hope happens in terms of recommendations from here on.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. One of the things that we're curious about is the nature of the different challenges that researchers faced when undertaking different forms of research. Was there anything in your research process that you came across as particularly challenging, or any barriers to undertaking the research that you had to overcome?
So the question for a state of the field piece, I think, not as someone who's written many of them, but as I approached this one, was, well, what is the field that I'm trying to take the state of? And then how broad or comprehensive should I be in doing that, right?
Mhm.
There can be a study that looks at every political science journal if you can try to define what a political science journal is. I don't even think there's agreement on this. So that was one of the initial challenges, and that also relates to the data collection, right? How many journals is enough journals to get sufficient coverage of the field and understanding? So, for example, I included Polity. That's a journal that's a regional journal in the United States for the Northeastern Political Science Association, but they only had two articles that mentioned human coders, right? So it's important to include them for completeness, but then it's important to make a decision about, well, then do I actually engage with their data in the analysis, which I chose not
Mhm.
to because there are only two cases in that context. But so that's those are some of the challenges I feel like inherent with state of the field pieces. The other challenge I engaged with was how to define the three criteria I was looking for. How strict should we be in saying that someone has done a quote unquote good job describing the human coding process? Well, that engages, of course, subjective judgments, which are inherently a human thing. Like even I'm deciding that as it's happening. And in that process, I thought that, well, the most important thing is at least to name what I'm trying to do and to say that in the paper and in the process, these are what I'm describing as the minimal standards. And if someone wants to come along in the future, they have, the replication data available, they can then go and describe more exacting standards. And in fact, one of the reviewers in the article for the piece said, well, can we go beyond the minimum? And so this led to a new section in the paper, right? Who is actually exceeding expectations in my mind? That's maybe a challenge to then come up with the idea of, well, who did really well, because that's a subjective judgment on my part. But I agreed with the reviewer in thinking that, well, it might be easier for us to all agree on a minimum standard. But then at some point, we want articles that are exceeding that standard and people who are being very thoughtful about that process. And so by including that section, I'm trying to say, well, here's something I think is beyond the minimum. But that's a challenge too, because then that relies even more on my individual subjective judgment. So it's this kind of weird situation where I'm writing a paper about human coding and I'm making decisions about, from a human perspective, about coding in the process, and then needing to describe those decisions. And I think that's a thing that really everyone engages with. We just don't always name in the process. And
Mhm.
dissertations are often a great place where an extensive section is devoted to this topic. But then when we get an article with a 5,000 word or 8,000 word character limit and reviewers are or word limit and reviewers are looking for a lot of other things, then we try to appeal to reviewers in that way. And so that's a challenge for the author. And that was a challenge for me in the piece, is thinking about what is the minimum standard? Is this an acceptable standard? To try
Mhm.
to learn that, I then looked at other social science disciplines that have had these types of conversations before, but inherently, of course, political science is a little bit different than communication studies or than sociology in the way that we engage with our data. And so I would certainly invite future research and ideas about how that process might work differently and how that data collection effort might lead to some different results with engaging with human coders from other researchers following up from this piece.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Dr. Obrokta. Maybe just to finish, could you talk to us a little bit about what future research plans you might have? Anything else that you're working on currently or intend to start?
So this piece is, mostly a methodology piece. And the way that I try to make methodological contributions is to think of less about the actual statistical method that's going on. There are a lot of excellent authors doing excellent work with that. And instead to think about the on the ground process by which the data is collected. And so I have a number of other projects that are looking at this concept of researcher distance. And I think that leads to this paper because if you, the author, are the one that's collecting the data, then you have a better idea of the decisions you're making. But if you're divorced from that process and very far away from that process, and we might have a survey firm that's being hired to collect some data for you, and then a graduate student who's managing that firm, and then a coder who's then coding the data and cleaning the data. And then you're on this end, then working with the graduate student who's doing, for example, the statistical analysis. And then what's produced to you, the author, is a report of what's kind of going on. Then the process of human coding is fairly obscured to you as the author. You may not even not be familiar with the fact that that's occurring and the decisions that are being made in that process. So I've been thinking about, well, how does this human coding part fit into the broader concept of researchers now being perhaps less familiar with the data that they're actually engaging with, even if, for example, you use an off-the-shelf data set that may be available online, then to what extent do we actually spend the time to go and research what those original authors were trying to do with the data set that they created? Or if we use something like a general social survey or European values survey, a general survey, then to what extent are we familiar with the goals and aims of that study, the questions that happened before and after that question, how the authors thought about those research questions? Or to what extent do we just take those questions as variables and run from there and start our analysis and assume that, oh, that's all been collected. They've all done all of that checking. And that's true that those collectors of the data sets have done that work, but they've done it for a specific purpose. And our purpose may be different. And we may then need to understand more about how those data were collected in a certain way, or as was discussed here, how humans were involved in that process. So I have some pieces trying to think about this distance element, which I think human coding is part of, but also rise of artificial intelligence, machine learning, graduate students being involved, this general push toward scientific teams as an endeavor, right? Like I have a research lab or a research team that can bring many benefits to the research process in terms of capacity, new insights, this type of thing. But I think we should just be careful in thinking about questions that are underlying how these data are collected. And so those are some of the projects that I'm working on that I think tie into this human coding element and hopefully will help researchers and myself, which is why I'm doing them, to help myself in my own substantive work, think about these questions and be very intentional about it. Not to say that I'm trying to pile another 10 things onto the list of things to think about, but research is hard. And so we should think about at least some of those questions as they apply, I think, to our own studies.
Very much agreed. Dr. Obrokta, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a fascinating conversation.
This has been the PSR's author interview series, where we take time to speak with the academics, researchers, and writers who have published work with us. To learn more about PSR, check out our website or find us on Blue Sky or LinkedIn. PSR is a Political Studies Association journal.